It is my great pleasure and privilege to be here today to join you from New York, where, as Deirdre mentioned, I have set up a company called Urban Scale. The presentation this morning is about two ways of approaching networked cities in the 21st century. It's called Another City is Possible, Dreaming Networked Urbanism and Doing It. And the first part of it is in the nature of a SITREP, a situation report. Because the fact of the matter is we stand here in 2011, in late 2011, some 5 years into the discourse now of smart cities. And I think that we are in a place where we can look around ourselves, take a look at the rhetoric that's been offered us, take a look at some of the early things that have been done to possibly substantiate that rhetoric, and to begin to ask ourselves what works and what doesn't, what does build value and what hasn't really, where we should be placing our bets and our investments, and what we might want to rethink. And for the last several years, I've framed my activity in the smart city domain between essentially two notions. One, a human notion about the population of the planet and where it lives, and the other, a technological notion, and how the people who live in cities are increasingly mediating that experience to themselves and each other. The first thing I want to report to you is that humanity is still urban. As of 2007, the United Nations Population Division released a finding that said that for the first time in human history, more than half of humanity now lived in what they call urban spaces and urban centers. Humanity is now and forevermore will be an urban species. So from here forward, if you want to talk about something human, you're necessarily talking about something urban. And I would argue that the same truth is true, the converse is true as well. And this opens up an entirely new area for technology. It forces technology, informatics, IT, ICT, to begin to reckon with some terrains and some facts about operating on those terrains that it hadn't ordinarily had to in the past. And we'll get into that in a little bit more detail in a bit. But the collision between urbanism, urban experience, and urban values, and technology, and what technology brings to the table, is producing a very fraught moment in which we have, as Deirdre mentioned, all sorts of benefit and equally all sorts of risks. But really, when we were thinking about informatics, technology, informatics are still pervasive and are only likely to become more so. We've begun to leave even the discourse of ubiquitous computing behind, this idea that information processing is leaving these boxes and maybe even these boxes that we hold in our hands, and it's just beginning to percolate into the air and inform everything we do. Information technology has begun to colonize everyday life and everyday experience to the extent that most of the things that we now do in cities are mediated ultimately by digital information processing and information sharing networks. Between these two circumstances, we've had, as I've mentioned, a couple of years of rhetoric about what's called the smart city. Every city now calls itself a smart city, wants to be a smart city, wants to have the technology to offer smart city platforms and programs and networks to people. But I find in my travels that there's really very little agreement about what this might mean, or even when people use this phrase, what they themselves mean by it. So I want to dig into that a little bit, and in the next 15 minutes or so explore the where, the how, the who, the why of the smart city, and ask ourselves again what relevance it might have to this moment in Dublin when we are launching Dublin, this open city data initiative. And the first thing I want to explore is the where of the smart city. Because the fact of the matter is that when this notion was first rolled out, the idea was that you had to do it in places like Songdo in Korea, a city that was built on landfill and on nothingness, on mud flats out by the airport, or you had to build it in the cleared terrain of a place like Masdar in the United Arab Emirates, or in Portugal in a place called Planet Valley, sites that were greenfield sites, that there was nothing there before, there were no cities there before, and there's nobody there who lived there. This sort of framing of the smart city allowed technology a free pass. It allowed technologists to treat cities as what the French philosopher Dubl called any space whatever. Unconditioned space at degree zero, with no history, no texture, no human reality. It allowed technology to do away with all that messy history. And the trouble is that as people who live in cities, we depend vitally on all that messy history to inform our understanding of our lives, to bring texture and resonance to the things we do in place. As a matter of fact, I would argue to you that the meaning and the value of living in one of Earth's great cities is that the texture of the place has been built up over time by an infinity of small acts. That in fact, there is no city in a greenfield site. So from my perspective, the real problem with the smart city, as it's been sold to us so far, is that most of us don't live there. And if I can take some advice from a bank robber, the very famous American bank robber, Willie Sutton, once was asked why he robbed banks. And he responded, well, because that's where the money is. I think that in my work personally, and given my name, this might be an ironic slide to put up, but I don't believe in greenfield sites at all. I believe in building smart cities where the people are, where the people live, where the people work, where the people dream, where the people are trying to shape a future. I want to spend a couple of moments talking about The Who, because this is also very important. And I don't mean the mod rock group of the 1960s. I mean the institutions that are primarily responsible for delivering this discourse of the smart city. We have in the room our esteemed colleagues from IBM, very often mentioned in this context, in this connection. We also have institutional players, large-scale technology organizations like Cisco and like Siemens. And let there be no doubt that these enterprises are in the business of business. They're in the business of technology. They may well function as systems integrators. I've even heard the smart city described as the missing link between the real estate and the technology sectors. And with all due respect, that leaves me a little bit cold. That leaves me a little bit cold as somebody who loves cities, because lacking from that description is any question of design, really, frankly, or necessarily of urbanism. And the next word I'm going to say in a very hushed voice, because it's probably a faux pas to speak of in this context, but missing from this particular discourse is any question of love. And I love cities, and I think many of us do. I always teach my students that if you scratch a New Yorker, you'll find an urbanist. And from what I've seen of Dublin in my visits here, the same thing is true here. Everybody loves the city that they're from. Everybody has passionate opinions about how we can devise better schemes to get through everyday life, how we can manage and organize things, how things ought to be done. Every single person you talk to on the street is likely to have an opinion about this. And you know, opinions vary in their quality, clearly, but this is the texture that's been missing from the discourse of the smart city as it's been offered to us by the large institutional players. So I think one of the primary opportunities that's bound up and folded into something like Dublin is the opportunity of bringing new voices to the table. New voices, new faces, new hands to do the work that's going to be necessary. Obviously, there's a great deal of thinking in the smart city about the how, the approach that we take to these technologies, and how to deliver the value that's bound up in them to the people who live in the cities that we care so much about. And I'm not trained as an architect. I'm something of a dilettante. I don't have any real disciplinary background in any of these fields, but I do sometimes think in terms of architects and urbanists and the insights they've brought to the table. And I think of two how approaches to smart city development. And one of them I associate with this man, the famous French architect Le Corbusier, and the model that he offered of cities as early as the 1920s. A model that was that he called the ville radieuse, the radiant city. This was a profoundly top-down way of thinking about places. It was an orientation towards the strict functional segregation of things like circulation, manufacture, housing, circulation. It was an idea that was predicated on watchfulness from above. And although Le Corbusier himself was not directly involved in the development of this city, if there's one city on earth that epitomizes the Corbusian virtues of watchfulness from above, it's the city of Brasilia, a city that's consecrated to administration, and as a result looks something like this. Now there's a fairly intense amount of formal beauty in Brasilia, but the trouble with it is that it was oriented around a way of thinking called optimum control theory. It was organized around the notion that every single thing that people do in life has a correct answer, a single correct answer, and an algorithm can be derived which will help you design things so that that single correct answer can be approached. I think anybody who's gotten to a certain point